The morning sun over the Virginia Beach training facility was already brutal, a thick humidity hanging in the air that made every breath feel like inhaling through a wet cloth. A new class of BUD/S candidates stood in formation, 47 men and 1 woman, all of them staring straight ahead at the churning gray Atlantic in the distance. The woman's name was Sarah Jenkins, and at 31, she was older than most of the men flanking her, some of whom were barely old enough to buy a beer. She stood at 5'6", a full head shorter than the average candidate. Her dark hair cropped close to her skull, her face a mask of absolute stillness. The other candidates had been stealing glances at her all morning, whispers passing between them like a contagion. Some of the looks were curious, but most were something else entirely: skepticism, resentment, and a thick, ugly layer of disbelief. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, and a 20-year veteran with a chest full of ribbons and a voice that could strip paint, walked down the line, stopping in front of each man to inspect his gear. When he reached Sarah, he paused, his eyes boring into hers. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply stared back, her gaze as flat and unreadable as the steel of a knife. Webb grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and moved on. But the damage was already done. His pause had been a spotlight, and the men around her noticed. To them, it was confirmation that she was an anomaly, a problem, a distraction. They didn't see a teammate. They saw a woman playing dress-up in their world. The first evolution of the day was the infamous 4-mile timed run on the soft sand. The instructors called it the sugar cookie, a warm-up designed to break spirits before the real work began. As the whistle blew, the pack surged forward, a mass of muscled bodies churning through the deep sand. Sarah settled into an easy, economical stride, her breathing measured and controlled. She didn't try to keep up with the front-runners, the young bulls who sprinted out of the gate, fueled by testosterone and the need to prove themselves. She knew this was a marathon, not a sprint, a lesson learned in a different kind of school, a different kind of war. About a mile in, the pack began to string out. The front-runners were already slowing, their initial burst of speed costing them dearly. But Sarah maintained her pace, passing one gasping man after another. She could hear their ragged breaths, the muttered curses. As she rounded a bend in the beach, she caught up to a cluster of 3 men walking, their hands on their hips, chests heaving. They were young, arrogant, the type who probably dominated their high school football fields. One of them, a broad-shouldered kid with a neck as thick as a fire hydrant, saw her approaching. A sneer twisted his red, sweat-sheened face. Look what we got here, boys," he said, loud enough for her to hear. "The little lady is catching up. Maybe she can give us a piggyback ride the rest of the way." His friends laughed, the sound weak and wheezing. Sarah didn't slow down. She didn't even look at him. She just kept running, her feet a metronome against the sand. As she drew even with them, the big one, whose name she would later learn was Kowalski, stuck out a foot. It was a subtle move, easily disguised as a stumble. But Sarah had spent years reading micro-expressions, anticipating the twitch of a trigger finger. She saw the slight shift of his weight, the flex of his quad, a full second before his foot moved. With a tiny, almost imperceptible sidestep, she avoided the trip. She didn't break stride. Kowalski and his buddies were left behind, their laughter dying in their throats as they watched her disappear into the heat shimmer ahead. Sarah finished the run in the top third of the class, at her time respectable, her lungs burning but not broken. When she jogged back to the formation, Chief Webb was there, a stopwatch in his hand. He glanced at her, then at the time. He said nothing, but for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes that wasn't pure contempt. It was a question. Who the hell is this woman? The real test began that afternoon. The instructors marched them into the surf, the water shockingly cold despite the heat of the day. They were put through log PT, a sadistic exercise where teams of 6 had to hoist massive, waterlogged telephone poles over their heads, performing endless sets of presses and squats in unison. The teams were chosen at random, and Sarah found herself on a log with Kowalski and 2 of his cronies. The log was a beast, easily 400 pounds of wet, splintery wood. The goal was simple: work as a team or fail together. From the first rep, it was clear that Kowalski had no intention of working with her. He and his friends would heave with exaggerated effort, then let the log sag on her side, forcing her to bear an impossible share of the weight. Her shoulders screamed, the muscles in her back burning with a fire that threatened to consume her. But she held. She planted her feet in the churning sand, gritted her teeth, and held. The instructors circled them like sharks, screaming insults, looking for any sign of weakness, and any excuse to ring the bell and send a candidate packing. "You call that a press, Jenkins? My grandmother can lift more than that, and she's been dead for 10 years, an instructor bellowed into her ear. She said nothing. She just pressed. Again, and again, and again. Her vision started to tunnel, black spots dancing at the edges. She could feel the tendons in her wrists threatening to snap. Kowalski, seeing her struggle, smirked. He gave a little extra shove on the next press, intentionally throwing the log off balance. It tilted precariously, threatening to crash down on them all. For a split second, the entire evolution hung in the balance. A dropped log meant an automatic fail for the whole team. Sarah, with a last desperate surge of strength, shifted her weight, adjusted her grip, and single-handedly stabilized the teetering mass of wood. The moment passed. The instructors, who had seen the entire thing, exchanged a glance. They didn't say a word. No, but they had seen it. They had seen her save her so-called teammates from their own sabotage. That night, in the squad bay, the tension was a living thing. The men were exhausted, their bodies raw, their nerves frayed. Sarah lay in her rack, staring at the bottom of the bunk above her, listening to the whispered conversations. She could hear her name, punctuated by low laughter and crude jokes. She heard Kowalski's voice, louder than the rest. "I don't care what the rules say," he was saying. "She's a liability. Women don't belong here. They don't have the guts. They don't have the strength. She'll quit. They all do. It's just a matter of time." Sarah closed her eyes. She didn't think about Kowalski. She didn't think about the log or the run. She thought about another place, another time. She thought about the sharp, dry smell of dust and cordite. She thought about the weight of a different kind of weapon, and the even heavier weight of a different kind of choice. She thought about the faces, 300 of them. She let the memories wash over her, not as a burden, but as a foundation. She had been tested before. She had been forged in a fire that these boys, with their muscles and their sneers, couldn't even begin to imagine. Sleep came, finally, a thin, restless veil over a mind that never truly shut down. Tomorrow would be worse, but she had been through worse, and she was still here. The second day dawned with a sky the color of a fresh bruise, and the instructors, fueled by coffee and a deep-seated desire to see these hopefuls quit, introduced them to the concrete. The grinder, a vast expanse of pavement that would become the stage for their waking nightmares, was where they would spend countless hours doing calisthenics until their muscles turned to jelly and their minds began to fracture. Today, it was all about the boats. The IBS, or Inflatable Boat Small, was a rubber craft that weighed over 200 pounds on its own, and carrying it was a team evolution, requiring absolute synchronization and communication. The teams were the same as the day before, and Sarah knew with a cold certainty that Kowalski's silent war had only just begun. "Okay, you miserable pieces of waste," an instructor screamed. "Grab your boats! On your heads! Move! Move! Move!" The teams scrambled, each group of 6 men and 1 woman rushing to their assigned rubber craft. Sarah's team hefted the boat onto their heads, the hard rubber edge digging into their scalps. The objective was to run in formation, the boat held aloft, navigating a series of obstacles. It was a test of collective strength and endurance. For Sarah, it was a test of survival. From the start, it was a disaster. Kowalski, positioned at the front on the opposite side from Sarah, ran at an uneven pace, causing the boat to seesaw wildly. The others following his lead were disjointed. Sarah in the middle was jerked and pulled, the boat threatening to tear itself from her grasp. Her neck muscles screamed in protest. She could feel a trickle of blood where the rubber edge was grinding against her scalp. She adjusted her stride, trying to find a rhythm. But every time she did, the pace would change again, deliberately thrown off by Kowalski's subtle cues to his friends. "This is your fault," one of them hissed at her, his voice muffled under the boat. "You're messing up the whole rhythm." Sarah didn't respond. Arguing was a waste of precious energy. She focused on her own piece of the boat, on keeping her section steady, even as the whole structure lurched and swayed. They stumbled through the course, their time abysmal. The instructors berated them, calling them the worst team they'd ever seen. "You call yourselves a crew? You're a bunch of ballerinas, a bunch of girls." The insult was aimed at all of them, but the subtext was clear. The presence of an actual woman was the ultimate degradation. And the next evolution was the wet and sandy. They were ordered to sit in the freezing surf and then roll in the sand, coating themselves in a gritty, abrasive paste that would chafe their skin raw for the rest of the day. It was a misery designed to break down the body, to create a constant low-level torture. As they sat in the surf, the cold waves crashing over them, Kowalski leaned close to Sarah, his voice a low, venomous whisper, just loud enough for her and the men nearest them to hear. You know what your problem is?" he said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You think you're one of us, but you're not. You're just a mascot, a publicity stunt. They'll never let you finish. And even if you did, no one in the teams would ever trust you. You'd be a liability, a target. The moment things got real, you'd freeze. It's in your DNA. Women freeze. They don't have the killer instinct." Sarah looked at him then. Really looked at him. She saw the arrogance, the ignorance, and the deep-seated insecurity that fueled his cruelty. She saw a boy who had never been truly tested, who had built his entire identity on physical strength and a cartoonish idea of masculinity. He was waiting for a reaction. He wanted tears, or anger, or a pathetic defense. He wanted her to break. Instead, she gave him nothing. Her face remained a placid mask. She turned her gaze back to the gray horizon, and in a voice so calm it was more unnerving than any scream, she said, "You don't know anything about me, Kowalski. Not one single thing." Her words hung in the salt air, simple and unshakable. For the first time, a flicker of something other than contempt crossed Kowalski's face. It was confusion. He had thrown his best punch, and she hadn't even flinched. She had simply stated a fact, and in doing so had made him feel small. It was a new sensation for him, and he didn't like it one bit. The instructors called them back to the grinder, and the moment passed. But the seed of doubt had been planted, not in Sarah, but in the minds of the other men on the team who had overheard the exchange. Who was this woman who could sit in the freezing water, covered in sand, and speak with such unnerving calm? As the days turned into a week, the harassment didn't stop, but it changed. It became more desperate. Kowalski and his friends continued their sabotage, a subtle nudge during a run that could cause a turned ankle. Accidentally kicking sand in her face during a rest period, leaving her gear slightly out of place during inspections so she would get dinged by the instructors. But their antics began to lose their effect on the rest of the team. A few of the other men, like a quiet Texan named Miller and a former college swimmer from California named Ortiz, started to watch her with a different kind of interest. They saw how she never complained, how she never blamed anyone else for her struggles, to how she simply put her head down and endured. They saw the raw power in her small frame, the almost superhuman core strength she displayed during flutter kicks and leg lifts. They saw a work ethic that matched, and often surpassed, their own. One night, during a rare moment of free time, Miller approached her. He was a big, gentle guy with a farmer's tan and thoughtful eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I see what Kowalski's doing. It's not right." Sarah looked up from cleaning her rifle, a task she performed with a meditative focus. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It does matter," Miller insisted. "We're supposed to be a team." Sarah considered him for a long moment. She saw sincerity in his eyes, a genuine desire to do the right thing. It was a flicker of light in the darkness of the squad bay. "Then be a teammate," she said simply. "Focus on the boat. Ignore the noise." It wasn't a grand alliance, but it was a start. In the crucible of BUD/S, small gestures of solidarity were like gold. The next day, during another brutal boat carry, Miller, without saying a word, subtly adjusted his pace to match Sarah's, creating a pocket of stability in the midst of Kowalski's chaos. Ortiz, seeing this, did the same. The boat, for the first time, felt a little less like a weapon being used against her and a little more like a shared burden. The instructors noticed the change. They didn't comment, but their eyes missed nothing. The dynamics of the team were shifting, and the fulcrum of that shift was the silent, unbreakable woman in the middle. The third week brought Hell Week, the crucible within the crucible. 130 hours of continuous training, with a maximum of 4 hours of sleep for the entire week. It was a gauntlet of cold, wet exhaustion and psychological manipulation designed to strip away every pretense and reveal the core of a man's soul. The candidates were pushed beyond every conceivable limit. They ran, they crawled through mud, they paddled boats in the freezing ocean, they did endless calisthenics in the sand. Their bodies broke down. Hallucinations became common. The infamous bell, the symbol of quitting, sat in the center of the grinder, its brass surface gleaming in the harsh lights, a constant temptation. Sarah, like the others, was a wreck. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Then her hands were a mass of blisters and raw flesh. A deep, bone-aching cold had settled into her, a chill that no amount of movement could dispel. But she kept moving. She had learned, in a place far worse than this, that the body could endure almost anything if the mind refused to quit. She became a machine, fueled by a will that was forged in the crucible of a different kind of war. Kowalski, on the other hand, was crumbling. His physical strength, once his greatest asset, was failing him. And the constant, sleep-deprived misery was exposing the weakness at his core. He had no inner reserves to draw upon, only a hollow shell of arrogance that was rapidly being eroded by the relentless surf and sand. He started making mistakes. He dropped his end of the boat during a critical evolution, costing the team a precious minute of rest. He forgot the sequence for a drill, earning the entire class a screaming tirade from the instructors. His confidence was shattered, and without it, he was just another exhausted, scared kid. On the third night of Hell Week, during a long, freezing boat paddle in the pitch-black ocean, Kowalski finally broke. They were navigating by compass, fighting against a strong current, their bodies numb with cold. Kowalski, at the tiller, started to panic. "We're lost!" he yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "We're going to die out here! This is insane! It's not worth it!" His fear was contagious. The other men in the boat, already on the edge of their own endurance, started to waver. The boat began to drift, the paddles becoming ineffective. It was a moment of crisis, a tipping point where the whole team could unravel. And then, a voice cut through the darkness. It was calm, steady, and utterly authoritative. "Kowalski, give me the tiller." It was Sarah. She didn't ask, she stated. Kowalski, too far gone to argue, simply handed it over. Sarah took control. She checked the compass. I identified a distant light on the shore and began giving quiet, precise orders. "Miller, starboard side, 3 hard strokes. Ortiz, port side, hold. Everyone else steady as she goes." Her voice was a lifeline in the chaos. The men, desperate for direction, responded instantly. They stopped listening to the panic in their own heads and started listening to her. The boat straightened out and began to cut through the waves, heading unerringly toward the checkpoint. For the rest of that night, Sarah led them. She didn't give a speech. She didn't try to motivate them with platitudes. She simply demonstrated competence. She knew where they were, she knew how to get them where they needed to be, and she communicated that certainty with every calm word. By the time they dragged the boat ashore, shivering and exhausted, something had fundamentally shifted. They had survived because of her. When they looked at her now, they didn't see a woman, an anomaly, a liability. They saw a teammate, and they saw a leader. When Hell Week ended, and the surviving candidates stumbled into their barracks for their first real sleep in over 5 days, the atmosphere was different. Nearly half the class had quit, including 2 of Kowalski's cronies. Kowalski himself was a ghost of his former self, his eyes hollow, his swagger gone. He didn't look at Sarah anymore. He couldn't. The next phase of training began. Dive phase. It was a new set of challenges, a new opportunity for the weak to wash out. But for Sarah, it was just another obstacle to be conquered. She had passed through the fire, and what emerged on the other side was not a candidate, but a Navy SEAL in the making, recognized not just by the instructors, but by the men who would one day call her their shipmate. The dive phase was a world of silent blue-green darkness. For men who thrived on the brute force of surface training, the underwater world was a great equalizer. Panic was the enemy here. A silent killer that could strike in the depths. They learned to use the Draeger LARV rebreather, a device that didn't emit telltale bubbles, allowing a SEAL to move unseen through enemy waters. It was complex, unforgiving, and required a level of calm and precision that many of the remaining candidates simply did not possess. Sarah, however, took to it like she was born there. The silence, the weightlessness, the absolute necessity of controlled breathing, it all felt familiar. It was like the Overwatch positions she had held for countless hours in her previous life, lying motionless for days, her breath the only sound, her world narrowed to a single crosshair and the target that would eventually walk into it. The instructors, who had watched her with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect, now observed her with open fascination. In the water, she wasn't just keeping up, she was excelling. Her air consumption rates were the lowest in the class, and her underwater navigation was spot on. She moved with a fluid grace that the others, for all their strength, could not match. One afternoon, during a complicated compass swim exercise in the murky waters of the bay, a candidate named Stevens got into trouble. He was a good guy, a former Army Ranger who had bought into the SEAL mystique. But something went wrong. His mask flooded, he panicked, and he bolted for the surface, a potentially fatal mistake that could cause an air embolism. His training took over for a second, and he tried to clear his mask, but his movements were jerky, uncontrolled. He was sinking, his regulator slipping from his mouth, his eyes wide with terror in the green gloom. Sarah, swimming a few yards away, saw it happen. Without a second's hesitation, she finned over to him. He was thrashing, a danger to himself and anyone who got near him. A less experienced diver would have been pulled down with him, but Sarah had dealt with panicking people before. She approached from behind, got him in a control hold, and forced her own backup regulator into his mouth. She purged it for him, the the rush of air shocking him into a moment of stillness. Through his mask, she locked eyes with him, and with a series of hand signals, told him to slow his breathing, to calm down. Her own breathing was slow, steady, a metronome of calm in the chaos. She held him there in the silent depths until the panic subsided from his eyes. Then slowly, she guided him to the surface, controlling their ascent, making sure they both cleared their safety stop. When they broke the surface, Stevens gasped and coughed, tears of relief and shame mixing with the salt water on his face. Sarah just treaded water next to him, saying nothing. The instructors in the safety boat had seen the whole thing. When they got back to the pool, the lead dive instructor, a man with a face like a clenched fist, called Sarah over. He stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. "You ever done that before?" he asked. "Rescued a panicked diver?" "No, instructor," she lied. She had never rescued a panicked diver. But she had talked a young soldier down from a panic attack in the middle of a firefight, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't reload his weapon. She had held the hand of a dying man, whispering to him in the dark, keeping him calm until the end. This was just a different kind of water. The instructor nodded slowly. "Oh, good instincts," was all he said. But the words carried a weight that was unmistakable. Word spread through the class. The woman had saved Stevens. She could have let him sink, let the problem solve itself. But she hadn't. She had risked herself for a teammate. That night in the barracks, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Even the most stubborn holdouts among the men, those who still clung to their prejudice, had to admit that Sarah Jenkins was more than just a survivor. She was the real deal. Stevens came to her bunk, his face still pale. He didn't say much. He just stuck out his hand. She shook it. No words were needed. The final phase was land warfare training. This was what they had all been waiting for: the shooting, the tactics, the patrolling. It was the essence of the SEAL teams, the reason they all wanted the Trident. And it was here that the men would finally see what Sarah was truly capable of. They expected her to be competent, maybe even good. And after the dive rescue, they had revised their expectations upward, but nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. The first day on the range, they zeroed their M4s, the familiar crack, crack, crack of gunfire echoing across the hills of the training base. Sarah was quiet, focused, her movements economical and precise as she adjusted her optics and checked her zero. To the men watching, she looked like a professional. They didn't know the half of it. The second day was the qualification course. They would shoot from various positions at various distances, engaging targets that popped up unexpectedly. It was a test of speed, accuracy, and weapon handling. As they waited for their turn, the men joked nervously, trying to burn off the tension. Sarah stood apart, her eyes scanning the range, cataloging every target, every piece of cover. She wasn't nervous. She was home. When her name was called, she stepped onto the line. She loaded her weapon, assumed a standing position, and waited for the first target to appear. The buzzer sounded. What happened next was something the men would talk about for the rest of their lives. Sarah Jenkins didn't just shoot the course, she owned it. She flowed from one position to the next with a fluid grace that made the complex sequence of movements look like a dance. Her transitions were seamless, her shots were perfectly placed, each one a clean, decisive hit. Thus there was no hesitation, no wasted motion. She was a machine designed for one purpose. The targets fell before them as if they were being yanked down by invisible wires. When the final buzzer sounded and the last target dropped, there was a moment of absolute silence on the range. Then the scoring NCO called out her results. It was the highest score any of them had ever seen on that course. It was nearly perfect. A low whistle came from somewhere in the crowd of candidates. "Holy shit," Ortiz breathed. "Where did she learn to shoot like that?" The instructors were stunned. The lead firearms instructor, a grizzled veteran named Senior Chief Thompson, walked over to Sarah, His eyes narrowed. He looked at her targets, all clustered in the kill zone. He looked back at her. "That's some pretty shooting, Jenkins," he said, his voice neutral. "Where'd you learn to handle a rifle?" Sarah looked back at him, her face calm. "I've had some training." "A senior chief," Thompson grunted. "Yeah, I can see that. Well, keep it up. You'll fit in just fine." He walked away, but he was troubled. He had seen that kind of shooting before. It wasn't the product of weekend plinking or even advanced military courses. It was the mark of a true expert, someone who had spent years and thousands of rounds honing their craft. It was the mark of a sniper. The final exercise of land warfare was a complex, multi-day simulated mission. They were split into squads and pitted against each other in a sprawling mock village. Sarah's squad, which included Miller, Ortiz, and a reluctant Kowalski, was tasked with clearing a series of buildings and capturing a high-value target. It was a chance to put all their tactical training together, to work as a cohesive unit. From the moment the exercise began, Sarah's squad functioned like a well-oiled machine. She wasn't the squad leader, but she was its silent heartbeat. But her suggestions during planning were simple, tactical, and brilliant. Her movements during the clearing drills were perfect. She was always in the right place, covering the right angle, her muzzle pointed in a safe but lethal direction. She communicated with hand signals that were crisp and clear. She was, without a doubt, the most tactically proficient member of the squad. The exercise culminated in an assault on the main building, where the enemy was holed up with the HVT. And the squad moved in, clearing room by room. Sarah was on the stack, her weapon up. As they entered the final room, an enemy fighter popped up from behind a barricade, his weapon trained on the squad leader. It was a kill shot. There was no time for the squad leader to react, but in that fraction of a second, Sarah's world narrowed. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the target, identified the threat, and fired 2 shots in rapid succession. Her simunition rounds hit the enemy square in the chest, and the exercise controller declared him dead. The threat was neutralized. The squad leader was alive. They had won. Back in the staging area, the squad was buzzing with adrenaline. Miller clapped Sarah on the shoulder. "You saved his ass, Jenkins! That was incredible." Even Kowalski, who had been silent and sullen for weeks, looked at her with something that might have been awe. The squad leader, a burly guy named Donovan, came up to her. He didn't say thank you. Instead, he just shook his head. "Where the hell did you come from?" he asked, the question genuine and full of wonder. Sarah just shrugged. "I'm just trying to pass the course, Donovan." But they all knew it was more than that. She wasn't just trying to pass. She was showing them all what a real warrior looked like. The day of the final cow he arrived, the culmination of months of hellish training. It was a grueling series of events designed to test everything they had learned, both physically and mentally. The men were a tight-knit group now, the survivors of a brutal shared experience. The prejudice against Sarah had evaporated, replaced by a deep and abiding respect. She had earned her place among them, not through words or arguments, but through sheer, undeniable competence and an unbreakable will. Even Kowalski, humbled by his own near failure and her quiet heroism, he had stopped his campaign of harassment. He kept to himself, a shadow of the arrogant bully who had started the course. The final evolution was a long-range reconnaissance patrol, a simulation of a real-world mission. They were inserted by rubber boats onto a hostile shore, had to navigate overland to an observation point, gather intelligence on a target, and then call in a simulated strike. It was long, difficult, and required every ounce of their training. Sarah was in her element, and the patience, the attention to detail, the ability to remain motionless and observant for hours, These were skills she had honed to a razor's edge in a previous life. She spotted the enemy positions long before anyone else, identified the patterns of their patrols, and guided her team into the perfect overwatch position. When the time came to call in the strike, she provided the coordinates with a calm precision that left the evaluating instructors impressed. After the exercise, and they were marched back to the grinder for the final time. The surviving candidates stood in formation, their bodies battered, their minds sharp, their hearts pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The instructors, led by Chief Webb and Senior Chief Thompson, stood before them. The silence was absolute. Webb began to speak, his voice rough with emotion. He talked about the cost of the trident, the brotherhood, the sacrifice. And he talked about the men who had quit and the men who had stayed. His eyes swept over the formation, pausing for a moment on Sarah. Then he called the names of the new SEALs, one by one. When he called Jenkins Sarah, the formation erupted. Miller whooped, Ortiz clapped, and even a few of the other men let out cheers. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated acceptance. Sarah stepped forward, her face still calm, but her eyes betraying a flicker of something, pride, relief, or a deep and abiding satisfaction. Webb pinned the trident on her collar, the gold eagle clutching an anchor and a flintlock pistol. He leaned in close, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "I was wrong about you, Jenkins," he said. "You've got more steel in you than most men I've ever met. Welcome to the teams." Sarah simply nodded. "Thank you, Chief." But the story wasn't over. The training was done, but the mystery of Sarah Jenkins remained. Who was this woman who could outshoot, outthink, and outlast almost every man in the class? The instructors, particularly Senior Chief Thompson, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. The shooting, the calm under pressure, the tactical brilliance, it all pointed to a background that was far beyond standard military training. He decided to do some digging. He made a few calls, pulled some strings, and accessed personnel files that were usually sealed. What he found made him sit back in his chair and stare at his computer screen for a long, silent minute. Sarah Jenkins hadn't just been in the military before joining the SEALs. She had been in an entirely different world. Her file was sparse, redacted in so many places it looked like a classified document, but the key details were there. For the past 8 years, she had been assigned to a Joint Special Operations Command unit, so secret its very name was classified. She had operated in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, places that didn't appear on any map. And her specialty, the reason she had been recruited into that shadowy world, was written in a single chilling line. Primary designated marksman/sniper. Confirmed eliminations, 300 plus. Senior Chief Thompson read the line again, and then a third time. 300 confirmed kills. It was a number that was almost incomprehensible. It was a number that belonged to legends, to men with names like Hathcock and Kyle, and it belonged to the quiet, unassuming woman who had just graduated from BUD/S, the woman who had been mocked and harassed for daring to think she could be a SEAL, the woman who had saved a teammate's life not once, but twice during training, the woman who had just earned her trident. He leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. The boys in the class, especially Kowalski, had no idea who they had been dealing with. They had been swimming, running, and shooting alongside one of the most lethal operators in the entire United States military, and she had never said a word. The graduation celebration was a raucous affair held at a bar near the base. The new SEALs, now brothers in the truest sense of the word, drank beer, told stories, and laughed with the wild abandon of men who had just survived a crucible. Sarah was there, sitting at a table with Miller and Ortiz, a bottle of water in her hand, and she was enjoying the camaraderie, the simple pleasure of being accepted. The atmosphere was light, the tension of the past months finally released. Men came up to her, clinked her bottle, and offered words of respect. She accepted them all with a quiet grace. Then, Kowalski appeared. He had been standing at the bar, nursing a beer, watching the celebration from the sidelines. He looked different now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a haunted, humbled expression. And he walked over to their table, and the conversation around it died down. Men watched, waiting to see what would happen. Kowalski stopped in front of Sarah. He looked at her for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he spoke. "I was an asshole," he said, his voice rough. "A complete and total asshole. The things I said to you, the things I did, they were wrong. I was wrong." He swallowed hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know that I know. And I was wrong about you from day one. You're not just a SEAL, Jenkins. You're the best damn one in our class." The bar was silent. Everyone was watching. Sarah looked up at Kowalski. She saw a broken young man who had been forced to confront his own inadequacies. She saw a bully who had been humbled, not by her anger, but by her example. She didn't feel any triumph. She didn't feel any hatred. She just felt tired, and maybe, just a little bit, she felt pity. She stood up. For a moment, everyone thought she was going to walk away. Instead, she extended her hand. "Thank you, Kowalski," she said simply. "We're shipmates now. That's all that matters." Kowalski stared at her hand for a second, then shook it, his grip firm but not aggressive. A cheer went up from the men around them. Miller slapped Kowalski on the back. Ortiz raised his glass. The moment of tension passed, and the celebration resumed, louder than before. The team was whole. The brotherhood was complete. But as the night wore on, Senior Chief Thompson, who had been watching from a corner booth with the other instructors, walked over to Sarah's table. He nodded to her, his expression serious. "Jenkins, can I have a word?" She followed him outside, into the cool night air. They stood under the dim light of a street lamp, the sounds of the bar muffled behind them. Thompson looked at her, his eyes appraising. "I did some checking on you," he said. "Pulled some strings. I saw your file." Sarah's face didn't change, but her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. She said nothing. Thompson continued. 300 in 8 years, that's a lot, Jenkins. A lot of weight to carry." "It's just a number, Senior Chief," she said quietly. "It's not something I think about." Thompson nodded slowly. He believed her. That was the scariest part. She wasn't a glory hound. She was a professional.